As the luxurious penthouse buzzed with the sounds of conversation and clinking glasses, the sudden ring of a phone cut through the noise, sharp and urgent. Ethan Caldwell, a billionaire known for his powerful presence in the tech world, glanced at the screen. The name flashing was unfamiliar, but the cold grip tightening around his chest told him he couldn't ignore it. He swiped to answer. "Hello?" His voice was calm, but a hint of tension lingered in the air, reflecting the urgency of the moment. "Sir, your wife is in danger." The voice on the other end cracked. Ethan froze. It was a small, shaky voice, a girl's voice, yet it carried the weight of something far too real. His mind raced, trying to make sense of the words, but there was no time for questions. "What are you talking about?" His words were short, clipped, as the air in the room seemed to grow thicker, each second stretching into eternity. "She's in the car, and they're following her," the girl continued, her voice now more urgent. "I know where they are. You have to get her out." Ethan's heart skipped a beat. "Who is this? What do you know?" His mind was still reeling, trying to connect the dots, but the girl cut through his questions. "They're going to hurt her," she said. "You need to stop them." Ethan's eyes darted to the door, his mind snapping into action. He stood up abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the marble floor. Without a second thought, he rushed out of the room, the phone still pressed tightly against his ear. "Stay with her," he commanded, his voice sharp now, filled with a sense of urgency he hadn't felt in years. "Tell me exactly where she is." I can't say too much, but I know they're planning something. She needs you. Now," the girl whispered, as if the very words themselves were too dangerous to speak aloud. Ethan's mind raced, trying to process what was happening. As he strode down the hall, heading for the elevator, his thoughts flashed back to the last time he had seen his wife, laughing and carefree, unaware of the danger lurking around the corner. He had been too busy, too consumed by his world of meetings, deals, and numbers to notice the cracks in her life. And now, here he was, rushing to save her, with nothing but the words of a stranger to guide him. The elevator doors slid open with a soft ping, and Ethan stepped inside, his fingers trembling as he hit the button for the parking garage. His mind was a storm of confusion, disbelief, and fear. Who was this girl? And why was she the one to reach out when his own security team hadn't noticed anything wrong? He could hear her voice in his ear again, quiet and strained. "You have to hurry. I don't know how long she has." The world outside the elevator blurred into a whirl of lights as the tension built to a fever pitch. Each passing second felt like a lifetime. He had no time to waste. The elevator jolted to a stop. Ethan's hand was already on the door, ready to burst out into the chaos below. He had no idea what awaited him, but one thing was clear: he was going to do whatever it took to save his wife. The girl had given him the first clue, and now, it was up to him to follow it to the end. "I have to get to her." The words echoed in Ethan's mind as he raced down the hallway, the faint hum of the elevator doors closing behind him. His pulse was thudding in his ears, each beat faster than the last. His mind was a whirlwind of confusion, adrenaline, and something darker: fear. He had spent years building an empire, conquering the world with his intellect, yet nothing had prepared him for this. Nothing had prepared him to face the raw, unfamiliar terror of not knowing whether the woman he loved was alive or in danger. The voice of the girl on the phone had been small, but it had shattered his calm like glass. She had known too much, and somehow, her words felt more urgent than anything else. The elevator doors opened with a soft chime, and Ethan hurried out into the parking garage. The sleek, black car he needed was parked just ahead. His heart was racing, his mind still on the girl's words. He tried to push it all aside, to focus on getting to his wife. The world outside the garage seemed distant, muted, as if nothing existed beyond the urgent need to reach her. He pulled open the car door and slid into the driver's seat. The engine roared to life beneath him, but it did nothing to calm his nerves. His fingers gripped the steering wheel so tight that his knuckles turned white. He pressed the gas pedal, the tires screeching as he sped through the streets of the city. The towering buildings blurred past him, a dizzying mix of glass and steel, but he hardly noticed. All he could think about was the girl's voice, and the chilling fear that something was already happening to his wife. The girl had spoken with such certainty, and the urgency in her tone had made it clear that she was not just guessing. She knew something, and whatever it was enough to convince Ethan to risk everything to get to her. The streets were empty at this hour, save for a few cars scattered here and there. Ethan's mind raced, wondering if it was already too late. He tried to block out the gnawing feeling of helplessness creeping in, but it was impossible. As he approached the intersection that led to the back roads, he thought back to his conversation with the girl. "Tell me where she is," he had begged, his voice tight with panic. "Just stay with her. I'll be there soon," she had responded, her words more like a command than a suggestion. Ethan had no choice but to trust her, even if he didn't fully understand why. The back roads were narrow, winding, and dark. The headlights of his car cut through the darkness, illuminating the shadows along the edges of the road. His grip on the wheel tightened even more as he sped down the winding path, determined to get there before it was too late. Every corner seemed to take longer, every moment stretched into eternity. His mind kept flashing back to his wife, laughing, carefree, alive. He remembered how they had shared quiet dinners, how they had whispered secrets in the dark, how she had held his hand during difficult times. She was his world, and now she was in danger. He couldn't help but think that if he had been more attentive, more present, maybe this wouldn't be happening. But there was no time for regret now. The sound of tires against gravel snapped him back to reality. He looked ahead, spotting a figure standing by the side of the road. His heart skipped a beat. There she was, the girl. She had been the one to reach out, to help him find his wife, and now she was standing here, just as she had promised. Her eyes were wide, full of something between fear and determination. She stepped forward as he pulled the car to a halt beside her. "She's still in danger," the girl said breathlessly, her voice trembling. Ethan nodded sharply, his focus now entirely on her. He had no idea what she knew or how she had become involved in this, but there was no time to question it. He needed answers, and he needed them now. He glanced around, making sure no one was following. The girl opened the door, sliding into the seat beside him. "We need to move fast," she urged. Ethan's foot slammed down on the gas pedal once more, and they shot off down the road. The girl's eyes darted nervously, scanning the dark landscape as if waiting for something to happen. "Where are we going?" Ethan asked, his voice tight. The girl hesitated before answering. "To the place where they're keeping her." The words hung in the air, heavy with fear. Ethan didn't question her. He just nodded, pushing the car to its limits, the engine roaring as he raced against time. The silence in the car was suffocating, filled only with the sound of the engine and the distant hum of the tires on the road. His mind was spinning, trying to keep up with the girl's cryptic words. He knew he had to stay focused. His wife's life was on the line, and whatever it was that the girl knew, it was the key to saving her. "I have to get to her." Ethan's mind raced as the girl sat beside him, her eyes darting nervously between the darkened road and the rearview mirror. The tension in the car was palpable, suffocating. Ethan's knuckles were white on the steering wheel as he pushed the car faster, the tires screeching in protest. "We're almost there," the girl whispered, her voice barely audible over the roar of the engine. "How do you know this? How do you know where she is?" Ethan's voice trembled, the desperation creeping in. He had no idea who this girl was, but he had no choice but to trust her now. The girl swallowed hard, her eyes focused ahead. "I saw them take her," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "They were in a van. I followed them, but I had to be careful. I knew you wouldn't believe me unless I showed you." Ethan's heart pounded in his chest, the shock of her words reverberating through him. "Who are they?" he asked, his voice tight with urgency. The girl's eyes met his for the first time, and there was something in her gaze that made Ethan shiver. "I don't know their names," she said, her voice low and strained, "but I know they've been watching her for weeks. They know you're busy. They know you wouldn't pay attention." Ethan felt a pang of guilt in his chest, but he pushed it aside. "Where are they taking her?" he demanded. The girl pointed ahead, toward an abandoned building that loomed in the distance. "There," she said. "That's where they're holding her. But we have to be careful. They might still be watching." Ethan nodded, his heart pounding faster. He could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him, but he couldn't slow down now. He had to save her. He had to find his wife before it was too late. As the car hurtled toward the building, Ethan's mind raced. He couldn't shake the image of his wife, her face filled with fear, trapped somewhere inside that dark, cold building. He thought back to everything he had ignored, all the moments he had let slip by without paying attention to her needs. All the meetings, the deals, the constant pressure of running his empire, it had all taken precedence over the woman he loved. He cursed himself for not seeing the signs sooner, for not protecting her when she needed him most. The building grew closer, its silhouette dark and imposing against the night sky. Ethan's breath came faster, and his grip on the steering wheel tightened even more. He could see the shadows of figures moving near the entrance. "We're getting too close," the girl said, her voice trembling now. Ethan didn't respond. He couldn't. Every part of him screamed to push forward, to burst through whatever barriers stood between him and his wife. The car screeched to a halt just a few yards from the building. Ethan threw the gear into park, his breath coming in short, rapid bursts. "Stay here," he said to the girl. "I'll go alone." The girl grabbed his arm before he could open the door. "No," she said, her voice sharp. "I'm coming with you. I know the layout of the place. You'll need me." Ethan hesitated, but then he realized she was right. She was the one who had led him this far, and he couldn't afford to be reckless now. "Fine," he said, his voice tense. "But stay close." Together, they stepped out of the car, the night air cool and thick with the smell of damp earth. The building loomed ahead, its windows dark, its structure decaying. Ethan's heart pounded as they approached, the silence broken only by the sound of their footsteps on the gravel. "There's a back entrance," the girl whispered, her voice barely audible. "Follow me." She led him around the side of the building, keeping low, moving quickly. Ethan's eyes darted around, scanning the shadows for any sign of movement. He could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. This was it. They were close now, but every instinct in his body screamed that they weren't alone. As they reached the back of the building, the girl paused, her hand on the door handle. She looked up at Ethan, her eyes wide with fear. "We have to be quiet," she warned. Ethan nodded, his jaw clenched. He couldn't afford to make a sound. With a deep breath, he pushed open the door, and they slipped inside, the darkness swallowing them whole. The door creaked as Ethan and the girl stepped into the darkened hallway. The musty air hung heavy, thick with the scent of dust and decay. Ethan's heart hammered in his chest, every step echoing loudly in the stillness. His eyes scanned the shadows, searching for any signs of movement. His grip on the door handle tightened as he glanced back at the girl, who was staying close behind him. She was silent, her eyes wide, but there was a determination in her gaze that matched his own. "Do you know where they're keeping her?" Ethan whispered, his voice barely a breath. The girl nodded. "Upstairs," she said, her voice low and steady. "There's a room at the end of the hall." Ethan's mind raced as they moved further into the building, his thoughts focused on his wife, who could be anywhere in this maze of corridors. He couldn't let himself think about anything else. The only thing that mattered now was getting to her. They reached the staircase at the far end of the hallway, its rusted banister creaking under their weight. The stairs were steep and uneven, but Ethan barely noticed, his focus entirely on the floor above them. As they ascended, he could hear faint noises coming from above, the sound of muffled voices, low and indistinct. His pulse quickened. The girl's hand was gripping the railing tightly, her steps quick but quiet. She glanced up at him, her eyes filled with urgency. "Hurry," she whispered. Ethan nodded, his breath shallow. He could feel the weight of time pressing down on him. They reached the top of the stairs, and the hallway stretched out before them, dimly lit by a single flickering light. At the end of the hall, a door stood ajar. Ethan's stomach tightened. He didn't need to be told it was the room. This was it. His mind raced through possible scenarios. Were they in there? Was his wife alone? Or was she in danger already? He took a deep breath and motioned for the girl to stay behind him. Slowly, he moved toward the door, his hand hovering near the knob. He pushed it open, his heart pounding as the hinges groaned. Inside, the room was dark, the only light coming from a small window high on the wall. Ethan's eyes darted around, scanning the space, but there was no sign of anyone. The room appeared empty. He stepped inside, his feet making no sound on the creaky wooden floor. "Where is she?" he whispered, his voice tight with fear. The girl stepped forward, her eyes scanning the room. "There," she said, pointing to a corner. Ethan's eyes followed her finger, and his breath caught in his throat. There, lying on the floor, was a figure, his wife, unconscious, her body pale and still. Panic surged through him as he rushed toward her, kneeling beside her. He checked for a pulse, his hands trembling as he pressed against her neck. There it was, faint but steady. Relief flooded his chest, but it was quickly replaced by anger. Who had done this to her? Who had hurt the woman he loved? "She's alive," he said, his voice hoarse. The girl knelt beside him, her expression somber. "But she won't stay that way for long if we don't get her out of here," she said urgently. Ethan nodded, his mind already racing with plans. He gently lifted his wife into his arms, cradling her against his chest. His heart broke as he looked down at her, her face bruised, her body limp. What had they done to her? He could feel her breathing, shallow but steady, and it steadied his own panic for a moment. But they couldn't stay here. They had to get out, and fast. "We have to go," he muttered, more to himself than to the girl. The girl nodded, standing up and glancing around the room. "This way," she said, leading him toward the door. As they moved quickly through the hallway, Ethan's mind flashed with images of the girl's warning, of everything she had told him. He had trusted her because he had no other choice, but now he was beginning to wonder, who was she really? How had she known so much? But there was no time to ask questions. As they neared the staircase, Ethan heard a noise, a door opening, voices murmuring from somewhere downstairs. His heart skipped a beat. They were not alone. They had to move faster. The girl grabbed his arm, pulling him into a small side room just off the hallway. "They're coming," she whispered urgently. Ethan's eyes widened in fear. "What now?" he breathed, his mind spinning. The girl's expression hardened. "We wait. We make sure they don't know we're here." Ethan nodded, but his hands were shaking as he held his wife closer to him, trying to keep her safe, trying to keep them both alive. He glanced at the girl, unsure of what to expect next. What kind of game was this, and how far would they go to stop him from escaping with his wife? The seconds felt like hours as Ethan and the girl crouched in the small, dimly lit room, barely daring to breathe. The air was thick with tension, and Ethan could hear the faint sounds of footsteps and muffled voices from downstairs. His heart raced, and his mind screamed for action. He had to get out of here with his wife. He couldn't afford to be caught now. The girl, her eyes wide with fear, was crouched beside him, her gaze flickering nervously toward the door. "What are we going to do?" Ethan whispered, his voice low and urgent. "We need to wait for the right moment," she replied, her voice steady but strained. "They'll pass by soon. We can make a run for it." Ethan nodded, his fingers tightening around his wife, still limp in his arms. He could feel her breath, shallow and weak, but she was alive, and that was all that mattered right now. Every second counted. The girl's voice broke through his thoughts again. "They don't know we're here," she said, her eyes locking onto his with intensity. "But that won't last long. They're coming, and they'll be searching every room. We need to move fast." Ethan's grip on his wife tightened as he shifted uneasily. He couldn't stay hidden forever. The risk was too great. The girl's eyes softened as she glanced at him, sensing his unease. "We're going to make it," she reassured him, her tone filled with quiet determination. Ethan swallowed hard, nodding once more. He had no choice but to trust her. The building creaked as more footsteps echoed through the hallway. Ethan's breath caught in his throat as the door to the room they were hiding in rattled slightly. He froze, his pulse quickening. The girl raised a finger to her lips, signaling for silence. Ethan's eyes darted around the small room, looking for any way out. The window. He could escape through the window, but it was too high up, and the drop would be dangerous. His mind raced for alternatives. Suddenly, a faint voice rose from downstairs, followed by the sound of heavy footsteps. "They've got to be upstairs," one of the men said, his voice gruff. "Search every room." Ethan's heart skipped a beat. It was now or never. He glanced at the girl. "What do we do?" he asked, his voice a low whisper. She didn't hesitate. "We run," she said simply. "When they're far enough, we go straight for the back exit. I know the way." Without waiting for further instructions, she moved quickly to the door, glancing out through the small crack between the door and the frame. The hall was empty. The girl made a quick motion with her hand, signaling for Ethan to follow. Holding his wife carefully, Ethan stood and moved swiftly behind her. They crept toward the door, their footsteps soundless on the wooden floor. The girl paused at the corner of the hall, peering out cautiously. When she saw that the coast was clear, she signaled to Ethan. "Now," she whispered, urgency in her voice. They darted down the hall, moving as quickly as possible without making a sound. Every inch of the old building felt like it was closing in on them, the walls pressing in as they neared the stairs. The sound of footsteps grew louder, and Ethan could feel the girl's tension. She glanced back at him, her expression grim. "We need to hurry," she urged, her voice barely above a whisper. They reached the top of the stairs, and Ethan felt the weight of his wife's body in his arms. His heart thudded in his chest as they made their way down the narrow staircase, each step bringing them closer to freedom. But the sounds of movement downstairs were growing louder, and Ethan's fear increased with each passing moment. As they reached the bottom of the stairs, the girl pointed to a door at the far end of the hallway. "That's the back exit," she said. "It's our only chance." Ethan didn't hesitate. He nodded, moving quickly toward the door. Just as his hand grasped the doorknob, a loud crash echoed from behind them, followed by frantic shouting. "They're coming!" the girl exclaimed, her voice urgent. "We need to go now." With a single motion, Ethan swung the door open and sprinted into the night, the cold air biting at his skin. The girl was right behind him, and they didn't stop running until they reached the safety of the alley. Ethan's breath came in heavy gasps, his body trembling from the adrenaline coursing through him. He glanced at the girl, his heart still racing. "We made it," he said, his voice hoarse. The girl gave him a small, exhausted smile. "For now," she said, her eyes scanning the alley for any signs of danger. Ethan nodded, still holding his wife close to him. They had escaped just barely, but there was no time to rest. They had to keep moving. They weren't safe yet. "We need to get her out of here," Ethan said urgently. The girl nodded, leading him through the darkened streets. As they moved through the city, Ethan's thoughts remained focused on his wife. He couldn't lose her. He wouldn't let anything happen to her, not after everything they'd been through. And now, with the girl's help, they had a chance to make it out. But the danger was far from over. They kept moving through the streets, the sound of their hurried footsteps echoing against the silent buildings around them. Ethan's mind was racing. Every part of him screamed for action. He had to get his wife to safety, but the night was still filled with dangers. The girl led the way, her pace swift, as she glanced over her shoulder every few moments to make sure they weren't being followed. "Where are we going?" Ethan asked, his voice hoarse from the adrenaline. "There's a place I know," she said, not slowing down. "It's safe, for now." Ethan nodded, following her through the dark alleys, his wife's unconscious body still cradled gently in his arms. He could feel the weight of her in his arms, but he refused to let it slow him down. Every second counted. As they turned down a narrow street, Ethan felt the cool breeze on his face, but it didn't do much to calm him. His thoughts were a whirlwind. Who were those men? Why had they taken his wife? And who was this girl who seemed to know so much? He glanced at her again, still trying to piece together how she was involved in this nightmare. "How do you know about them?" he asked, his voice quieter now. The girl hesitated but didn't stop walking. "I overheard them. They were planning something. I didn't know what at first, but then I saw them take your wife. I had to help." Ethan looked at her, a mixture of gratitude and confusion on his face. "Thank you," he said, his voice low. "But who are you?" The girl didn't answer immediately. She just kept moving, her eyes scanning the dark corners of the street, as if expecting someone to jump out at any moment. "It's not important," she said finally. "All that matters now is getting her to safety." Ethan didn't press her further. He knew there were more questions, but they could wait. Right now, his wife's safety was the only thing that mattered. They reached a small, inconspicuous door hidden behind a stack of old crates. The girl pushed it open and gestured for Ethan to follow. "In here," she said, her voice tense. Ethan stepped inside, still holding his wife. The door clicked shut behind them, and they were enveloped in the darkness of the small room. It was a stark contrast to the chaos outside. For the first time in hours, Ethan felt a small measure of relief. He could hear the faint sounds of traffic and distant voices, but inside this hidden space, it was quiet. "Is this safe?" Ethan asked, looking around. The girl nodded. "For now, but we need to stay here until it's clear." Ethan laid his wife down gently on an old worn couch, his heart still racing. He knelt beside her, checking her pulse again, just to make sure. It was steady, but too slow. He felt a sharp pang of worry. "What did they do to her?" he muttered to himself. "She'll be okay," the girl said, her voice calm despite the tension in the room. "But we need to keep her safe. They won't stop looking for her." Ethan looked up at the girl, his brow furrowed. "Who are they?" The girl took a deep breath, her face hardening. "They're dangerous people. I don't know all the details, but they've been watching you and your wife for weeks. They want something from you." Ethan's mind went blank for a moment. He had been so focused on his business, his empire, that he had no idea this kind of threat was looming in the background. "What do they want?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know," the girl answered, "but they're not going to stop until they get it. We need to figure out what they want and how to stop them." Ethan clenched his fists, his eyes narrowing. "We will. I won't let them get away with this." He stood up abruptly, his hands trembling with the weight of the situation. The girl looked at him, her expression serious. "You need to stay calm," she warned. "If you act recklessly, you could make things worse." Ethan took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. He was so close. He could feel the anger rising in him, but he knew that he had to keep his head clear. "You're right," he said, his voice steadying. "We have to figure this out. Fast." The girl nodded. "I'll help you, but we need to keep her hidden. They'll be looking for her, and they won't stop until they find her." Ethan looked down at his wife, his heart aching. He couldn't lose her. He had to protect her. "We'll keep her safe," he said, his voice firm. "I'll do whatever it takes." The girl turned toward the window, peering out cautiously. "We need to move again soon," she said, her voice tense. "We can't stay here long." Ethan nodded, his mind already working through the next steps. They had to stay one step ahead of whoever was hunting them. His wife's life depended on it. As Ethan paced the small, dimly lit room, his mind raced with thoughts of what had just happened. They had made it this far, but the danger was far from over. The girl, who had saved them from the building, had been calm, composed, but her eyes betrayed the urgency of the situation. Ethan knew they couldn't stay hidden for long. "We need to go," he said, his voice steady but filled with a quiet urgency. The girl nodded, her gaze flicking to the window as she pulled the curtain aside just enough to peek outside. The streets were empty, but that didn't mean they were safe. They had been on the run for hours, and the sense of being hunted never left Ethan's mind. He looked down at his wife, still unconscious, lying on the makeshift couch in the corner. Her face was bruised, her breathing shallow, but she was alive, and that was all that mattered right now. The girl moved toward the door, her eyes still scanning the street outside. "We have to be quick," she said, her voice low. "I know a place we can go, but we need to leave now. They'll be looking for us." Ethan nodded, standing up and moving to his wife. Gently, he lifted her into his arms, trying not to disturb her. The girl stepped aside, allowing him to pass. "This way," she said, and they moved toward the back door. It creaked open, the sound sharp in the otherwise silent room. The night air hit them as they stepped outside, and Ethan's skin prickled with the cool breeze. He looked around, every shadow in the darkened alley feeling like a potential threat. He had no idea who was chasing them, but he knew one thing: he had to protect his wife. The girl led them down the narrow alley, moving quickly but cautiously. "Where are we going?" Ethan asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "A safe house," the girl replied, glancing back at him. "It's not far. I've been there before." Ethan didn't ask any more questions. He trusted her, or at least he had no other choice. They had already been through too much together to turn back now. As they made their way through the city, Ethan kept his eyes open, alert to any movement or noise. The streets were eerily quiet, and he couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. "They're close," the girl muttered, her eyes flicking nervously over her shoulder. Ethan's heart skipped a beat. "Who?" he asked, his voice tight. "The people after you. The ones who took your wife. They'll stop at nothing to find her." Ethan clenched his jaw, Why? The girl didn't answer immediately, her pace quickening. I don't know, she said finally, her voice tinged with frustration. But they want something from you. I don't know what it is, but I can't let them get her. Ethan's mind raced. He had been so consumed by his business, by the empire he had built, that he never noticed the shadows creeping around him, threatening everything he cared about. His wife had always been the one thing he took for granted, the one thing he couldn't afford to lose. He wasn't going to let anyone take her now. They reached the end of the alley, and the girl stopped, glancing both ways before signaling for Ethan to follow. They crossed the street and turned into another alleyway, where a small door led into a narrow building. The girl pushed it open, and they stepped inside. The place was dark, quiet, and hidden away from the chaos outside. Ethan let out a breath he didn't realize he was holding. It wasn't much, but for now, it was safe. This is it, the girl said, closing the door behind them. We'll stay here until we figure out what to do next. Ethan nodded, still holding his wife close to him. He couldn't let his guard down, not for a second. They were still in danger. The girl moved to the corner, pulling out a flashlight and shining it around the room. It was a small, cluttered space. Nothing fancy, but it was safe, at least for now. I'll stay with you, the girl said, her eyes meeting Ethan's, but we can't stay here for long. We need to figure out what they want and how to stop them. Ethan didn't reply. His mind was too consumed with thoughts of his wife, who still lay unconscious in his arms. He needed answers. He needed to know who was behind this and why they were targeting his family. The girl was right. They couldn't stay here forever. I'll do whatever it takes to keep her safe, Ethan said, his voice low and filled with resolve. The girl gave him a small nod. We'll figure it out, she said quietly. But for now, we wait. We stay hidden. Ethan looked down at his wife, her face pale and bruised, and he vowed that no matter what it took, he would find the answers. He would protect her. No one would take her from him. The hours dragged on, the stillness of the small room pressing down on Ethan. His mind was a whirlwind of thoughts, his wife still unconscious, the girl who had helped them but remained a mystery, and the looming threat of whoever was after them. The girl had been right. They couldn't stay here forever. His eyes flicked to the window, the faint light of dawn beginning to creep through the cracks in the blinds. They had to figure out their next move, and fast. He looked at his wife again, her face pale and bruised, his heart clenched. She had been through so much already. He couldn't let her go through anymore. How long do we have before they find us? Ethan asked, his voice hoarse. The girl, who had been sitting quietly in the corner, looked up at him. Not long, she said, her voice tense. They've already started looking. We need to move before they get too close. Ethan nodded, his mind racing. He stood up and walked to the window, pulling the blinds just enough to peek outside. The streets were still empty, but that didn't mean they were safe. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. He turned back to the girl. Do you know who they are? What they want? He asked, his voice demanding answers. The girl hesitated for a moment, her eyes darting to the door, as if she was considering whether to tell him the truth. Finally, she spoke. They're part of a larger organization. I don't know much about them, but I know they've been targeting you. They want something big, and they won't stop until they get it. Ethan's mind whirled. Something big? He repeated. What could they want with me? I've been too busy with work to even notice anything out of the ordinary. The girl's eyes softened, and she stood up, moving toward him. That's the thing. They've been watching you. They know your every move. Your wife was just the first step. They're going to come after you next. Ethan's stomach tightened. He could feel the weight of her words sinking in. What do you mean? What's next? He asked, his voice rising. The girl stepped closer to him, her face serious. They want to take you down, Ethan. They'll stop at nothing to get what they want. They don't care who they hurt along the way, and you can't stop them unless you know what they want. Ethan clenched his fists, his anger rising. How do we figure that out? The girl hesitated for a moment, her eyes darting to his wife, still lying motionless on the couch. We need to find out what they're really after, she said softly. There's something they think you have, something they're willing to kill for. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. Something I have? He repeated, his mind racing through every possible scenario. What could it be? The girl looked down, as if struggling with the weight of the information she was about to share. "It's not just about money or power," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's something far more dangerous, and I don't think they'll stop until they've got it." Ethan felt a chill run down his spine. His eyes turned back to his wife, and his mind raced, trying to put the pieces together. "What do we do now?" he asked, his voice desperate. The girl stepped forward, her eyes meeting his with a look of determination. "We need to find out what they want before it's too late. And we need to stay one step ahead of them. If we don't, they'll come for us again." Ethan looked at her, a fierce determination in his eyes. "I'll do whatever it takes to protect her," he said, his voice steady despite the fear gnawing at him. The girl nodded, her expression softening for a brief moment. "I know," she said, "but we're running out of time." She glanced toward the door, her body tense. "They're getting closer. We have to go." Ethan nodded, his heart pounding in his chest. The danger wasn't over. It was just beginning. With one last look at his wife, he turned and followed the girl out of the room, knowing that the only thing standing between them and certain danger was the small window of time they had left. They had to find out what the enemy wanted, and they had to do it fast. His mind was already calculating their next move as they moved swiftly through the building, the girl leading the way, her footsteps quiet but urgent. Ethan's heart raced as they slipped through the shadows, each step bringing them closer to the truth and closer to the danger that was waiting for them. Whatever lay ahead, he would face it head-on, because nothing, not even the dark forces chasing them, would stop him from protecting the woman he loved. The air was thick with tension as Ethan and the girl made their way through the winding alleyways, their footsteps quick and purposeful. They had to act fast. They were running out of time. Ethan could feel the weight of the danger pressing in on them with every step. His mind was a storm of thoughts, his wife, still unconscious, her life hanging in the balance, and the mysterious organization that was after them. Who were they? What did they want? He couldn't shake the nagging feeling that they were being watched, but he pushed the thought aside. There was no room for fear now. They reached the end of the alley, where a black sedan was parked, its engine running. The girl led him to the car, and Ethan hesitated for a moment, glancing over his shoulder. "We need to keep moving," the girl said, her voice urgent. Ethan nodded and climbed into the car, his wife still in his arms. The girl slammed the door shut behind them, and the car sped off into the night, its tires screeching against the pavement. The city blurred past them, the lights flickering in the distance. Ethan looked at the girl, his mind racing with questions. "What now?" he asked. "We're almost there," she replied, her voice steady but filled with a quiet urgency. "We need to find out what they want. You need to understand why they've been targeting you." Ethan clenched his fists, his mind racing. "But why her?" he asked, his voice filled with frustration. "Why take my wife?" The girl's eyes darted to him, her gaze piercing. "Because you're important," she said simply, "and they want something from you. Something that you have, something that they believe will give them power." Ethan's stomach churned. He had always been too wrapped up in his work to notice the shadows creeping in around him. He had no idea what kind of power these people wanted from him. But he knew it couldn't be good. "What are we dealing with here?" he asked, his voice tight. "I don't have all the answers," the girl said, her eyes flicking nervously to the rearview mirror. "But I know enough to know that you're in grave danger. If we don't figure this out, they'll keep coming for you, and for her." Ethan looked down at his wife, her body still limp in his arms. He couldn't lose her. He wouldn't. "We'll figure it out," he said through gritted teeth. "We'll find out what they want, and we'll stop them." The girl nodded, her expression serious. "We need to find a place to lay low for now," she said. "They'll be looking for us, and we can't afford to be found. We need to keep you safe." Ethan nodded, his eyes narrowing. He knew she was right. They couldn't afford to make any mistakes. The car turned a corner and slowed, pulling into a quiet, unlit street. The girl gave a quick glance to the street before turning into a small, inconspicuous building. "This is it," she said, as the car came to a stop. Ethan glanced out the window, his heart still racing. The building looked like nothing more than a rundown warehouse. There was no sign of anyone following them, but he knew they couldn't be too careful. The girl opened the door and stepped out first, motioning for Ethan to follow. He hesitated for a moment, then carefully lifted his wife out of the car, her fragile form pressing against his chest. "Come on," the girl urged, her voice low and quiet. "We don't have much time." Ethan followed her into the building, the door creaking behind him as it closed with a soft thud. Inside, the place was dimly lit and cold. The air smelled of dust and neglect. "Where are we?" Ethan asked, his voice filled with suspicion. "A safe place," the girl said. "I've been here before. We'll be safe for now." Ethan nodded, but the unease gnawing at him wouldn't go away. There were too many unanswered questions, too many dangers lurking in the shadows. "How do we stop them?" he asked, looking down at his wife. "We need to find out what they're after," the girl said, her voice tense. "And once we know, we can use it against them." Ethan looked at her, his mind racing. "And how do we do that?" The girl's eyes flickered with something almost like determination. "We have to go after them. Find out who's behind this. It's the only way to stop them." Ethan hesitated for a moment, but only for a moment. He couldn't afford to wait any longer. His wife was depending on him. "Let's do it," he said, his voice filled with quiet resolve. "We'll find out what they want, and we'll make them pay." The girl nodded, her eyes meeting his with a look of understanding. "We'll get through this," she said, her voice steady. "We have to." The sound of footsteps echoed from the far end of the building, and Ethan's senses sharpened. They weren't alone anymore. The game had just begun, and the stakes were higher than ever. Ethan took a deep breath, ready for whatever was coming next. He would protect his wife. He would stop them. He had no other choice. The tension in the air was palpable as Ethan and the girl moved quietly through the dark warehouse. They had found a temporary place to hide, but the danger was far from over. Ethan's mind raced with thoughts of what to do next, his wife still unconscious and resting in a corner of the dimly lit room. She was safe, for now, but he knew they couldn't stay here forever. The girl glanced over at him, her expression serious. "We don't have much time," she said in a low voice. "They'll be coming soon. We need to get to them before they get to us." Ethan clenched his fists, his heart pounding. Every part of him screamed for action, for answers. He couldn't let this drag on any longer. He needed to know what was happening, why they were being hunted, and most importantly, how he could protect his wife. "How do we find them?" Ethan asked, his voice tight with determination. The girl hesitated for a moment before responding. "There's a safe house I know about. It's not far from here, but to get there, we need to pass through their territory. They'll be watching the roads, and we'll have to be careful." Ethan nodded, his mind working over the details. He could feel the weight of the situation bearing down on him. The girl moved toward the corner of the room, picking up a bag and quickly shoving a few things inside. Ethan glanced at his wife again, the pain in his chest growing. He had to keep her safe. That was the only thing that mattered. "How will we get through their territory without being seen?" Ethan asked, still not sure of the girl's plan. "I know the way," she said, turning to face him. "There's a back route through the city. It's not the fastest, but it's the safest." She paused for a moment, as if weighing her words carefully. "But we need to be quiet, and we need to move fast. If we stay here any longer, they'll find us." Ethan felt a cold knot in his stomach. He had no choice but to trust her. He wasn't a stranger to high-stakes situations. But this was different. This wasn't just about business deals and corporate battles. This was about his life, his wife's life, and everything he held dear. The girl grabbed a flashlight from her bag and motioned for Ethan to follow. "Stay close," she whispered, as they moved toward the exit. Ethan nodded, lifting his wife carefully in his arms, trying not to disturb her. He was thankful she was still breathing, still alive. But he knew he had to act quickly. They stepped into the night, the air cool and heavy with tension. Ethan scanned the area, his senses on high alert. There was no sign of movement, but the silence was unnerving. The girl led the way, moving quickly but cautiously. Ethan followed, keeping a sharp eye on their surroundings. They passed through darkened streets, the sound of their footsteps the only noise breaking the silence. "We're almost there," the girl said quietly, glancing back at Ethan. "Just keep moving." They reached a small alleyway and ducked into it, staying close to the shadows. The girl pulled out a map and studied it briefly before tucking it away. "We're cutting through this alley and heading toward the next street. It'll take us around the perimeter of their operation." Ethan followed her lead, his mind constantly alert to every sound. Every car passing by, every distant voice, sent a spike of adrenaline through him. They were so close, yet so far from safety. The alley was narrow, the air thick with the smell of old garbage and damp concrete. They turned the corner, and the girl held up her hand to signal for Ethan to stop. He did, his heart racing in his chest. She peered around the corner, then motioned for him to follow. They moved quickly, keeping low to the ground. As they neared the street, the girl held up a hand once again. "We're almost at the safe house," she whispered, "just a little further." Ethan's heart was pounding, every step feeling like an eternity. He couldn't lose her. He couldn't lose everything. They rounded the corner and walked toward a small, inconspicuous building that blended in with the others. The girl approached the door, her movements quick and deliberate. She knocked twice, then waited. A moment later, the door creaked open, revealing a darkened interior. The girl stepped inside and gestured for Ethan to follow. "Come on," she said. Ethan hesitated for a moment, looking around once more. There was no sign of anyone following them, but he knew better than to trust the quiet. He stepped inside, the door closing behind him with a soft click. Inside, the room was small and sparse, but it felt like a sanctuary compared to the chaos outside. The girl turned to him, her expression serious. "We'll be safe here for now," she said. "But we need to figure out what they want, and we need to do it quickly." Ethan nodded, his mind still racing. "We will," he said firmly. "I'll do whatever it takes to keep her safe." The girl nodded in understanding. "I know," she said quietly. "We'll figure this out, together." Ethan looked down at his wife, who was still unconscious but alive. He would do anything to protect her. Anything. And no one would stop him. The silence in the small room was suffocating. Ethan stood by the window, staring out into the darkened streets below. The night had stretched on for what felt like an eternity, and every second that passed felt like they were waiting for something inevitable to happen. His wife was still unconscious, her breathing shallow but steady. He hadn't left her side for a moment, but as much as he wanted to stay by her and protect her, he knew they couldn't stay hidden forever. They had no idea who was coming after them or why, but Ethan was determined to find out. The girl, who had led them here, was sitting at the small table in the corner, looking through papers she had pulled from a bag. She seemed unfazed by the tension in the room, her eyes scanning each document with intensity. Ethan turned from the window and walked over to her. "What are we going to do next?" he asked, his voice filled with urgency. The girl looked up at him, her expression focused. "We need to find the core of this. We need to know who's behind this, and we need to get ahead of them. If we wait too long, they'll close in." Ethan clenched his fists, frustration bubbling up inside him. "How do we do that? We don't even know what they want from me. How do we stop them?" The girl paused for a moment before answering, her voice calm but heavy with knowledge. "They want something valuable, something you have. I don't know exactly what it is, but it's something they think will give them the power they need, and they won't stop until they get it." Ethan felt a cold wave of dread wash over him. "But what could they want from me? I've spent my life building an empire, not making enemies," he muttered, more to himself than to the girl. She stared at him for a moment, her eyes narrowing as if she were weighing his words carefully. "It's not about your empire, Ethan," she said softly. "It's about what you've built, what you know. You're more valuable to them than you think. They think you have information, something that will help them control everything." Ethan's mind was spinning. Information? What could he have that was so important? He thought back to everything he'd been working on, every project, every deal. He had never thought of himself as a target, but now, with everything that had happened, it made sense. He had been too focused on his business to notice the shadows lurking around him. The girl stood up and moved to the small desk in the corner of the room. She shuffled through some more papers before picking up a small device and handing it to Ethan. "This is the key," she said, her voice low. "If we can decrypt this, we'll have the answers. This is how we find out what they really want and who's behind all of this." Ethan took the device, holding it carefully in his hands. It looked like an ordinary piece of tech equipment, but the weight of it felt like something much more significant. "What is this? And how do you know it's the key?" he asked, his voice filled with disbelief. The girl gave him a quick, serious glance. I know because I've seen them use it. They think it's the last piece they need to complete their plans. They've been looking for it for a long time. And now we have it. Ethan's heart raced. This was the moment he had been waiting for. The chance to take control of the situation. How do we decrypt it? He asked. The girl moved to the table and began typing on her laptop. I have a few connections, but it's not going to be easy. We'll need to be fast, and we'll need to be careful. If we don't get it right, they'll know we have it, and once they know, they'll come for us. Ethan nodded, feeling the weight of the situation settle on his shoulders. He couldn't afford to make any mistakes. His wife's life was at stake, and he had no intention of letting anyone hurt her. The girl's fingers flew over the keys as she worked quickly, her eyes scanning the screen. Ethan's eyes flicked to his wife, still lying in the corner, vulnerable but alive. He took a deep breath, his heart still racing. He couldn't let anything happen to her. The girl typed one last command into the laptop, and the screen flickered to life, displaying a series of codes. We've got a lead, she said, her voice steady. Ethan moved closer, his eyes scanning the information on the screen. What does it mean? He asked. The girl's expression remained unreadable as she looked at the codes. It means we have a chance to find out who's behind all of this. But it also means that the clock is ticking. They'll know soon, and when they do, they'll be coming for us. Ethan nodded. The realization hit him hard. This was it. This was the moment that would decide everything. They had the answers, but they also had the enemy hot on their heels. There was no turning back now. The girl turned to him, her eyes filled with resolve. We need to move, Ethan. We can't waste any more time. Ethan looked down at his wife once more, her fragile form lying in the corner. He stood up straight, determination flooding his veins. Let's go, he said, his voice firm. We find out who they are, and we end this. They had no other choice. They were in this together now, and nothing would stop them from getting the answers they needed. The sound of footsteps echoed down the narrow hallway, sharp and deliberate. Ethan's pulse quickened, every instinct telling him they were close. The girl moved ahead, her eyes darting from side to side, cautious but determined. Ethan held his breath, his wife still resting in his arms, her fragile form a constant reminder of the danger they were in. We need to move fast, the girl whispered, her voice low but urgent. Ethan nodded, his grip tightening on his wife. Every step they took felt like a countdown, the weight of what was at stake pressing down on him. They were moments away from what would either be their salvation or their end. As they reached the door at the end of the hall, the girl paused, listening carefully. Ethan stood still, his heart pounding in his chest. He couldn't afford to make a sound, not now. The seconds stretched out like an eternity, but then the girl gave a slight nod and quietly turned the doorknob. It creaked softly as it opened, revealing a dimly lit room beyond. Ethan followed her in, careful to keep his steps light, but his mind was racing. This is it, the girl said, looking around the room. The meeting point. From here, we'll know what they're after. Ethan barely registered her words, his eyes scanning the space for any signs of danger. The room was small, cluttered with papers and equipment, but there was a feeling of calm amidst the chaos. The girl moved quickly to a desk at the far side of the room, pulling open a drawer and rifling through it. She pulled out a small, sleek device and handed it to Ethan. This is their tracking device, she explained. It's how they've been tracking your every move. We need to destroy it if we want to have any chance of staying off their radar. Ethan took the device from her, his fingers trembling as he examined it. He could feel the weight of it, the key to everything they had been running from. How do we destroy it? He asked, his voice tight with the realization of just how close they were to ending this nightmare. The girl stepped closer, her eyes focused on the device. I know how to disable it, but we'll need a few minutes to make sure it's done right. If we don't, they'll know exactly where we are, and we won't make it out. Ethan nodded, setting his wife down gently on the table. He didn't want to leave her side. But he knew that in this moment, their survival depended on what they did next. The girl moved swiftly, her fingers moving across the device's controls with practiced ease. Ethan watched as the screen flickered to life, a series of codes scrolling rapidly. We need to hurry, she said, glancing over at him. Once it's disabled, we can finally figure out who they are and what they want. But we have to be careful. They won't give up easily. Ethan could feel the tension rising. His eyes flicked to his wife, still unconscious and vulnerable, and his resolve hardened. No matter what it took, he wasn't going to let anything happen to her. The girl's hands moved quickly, pressing a series of buttons in rapid succession. A small beep echoed in the room, and the screen went blank. "It's done," she said, her voice filled with quiet relief. For now, anyway. Ethan exhaled sharply, his body stiff with the realization that they had just taken the first real step toward freedom. But the relief was short-lived. A loud crash from the hallway broke the silence, followed by voices shouting. "They're here," the girl hissed, her face pale. "We have to move now." Ethan's heart skipped a beat, adrenaline surging through his veins. "Where?" he asked urgently. "This way," the girl said, grabbing his arm and pulling him toward a back door. Ethan didn't hesitate. He grabbed his wife, lifting her into his arms once again, and followed the girl down the narrow corridor. The sounds of footsteps grew louder, and he could hear shouts growing closer. His mind raced, trying to come up with a plan. "There's an escape tunnel ahead," the girl said, her voice strained. "It leads out to the alley. We can lose them there." Ethan nodded, determined to make it out. They reached the tunnel entrance, and the girl pulled open a small door hidden behind a stack of crates. It creaked loudly, but they had no choice. Ethan's pulse thundered in his ears as they moved into the darkness, the sounds of pursuit echoing behind them. The tunnel was cramped and cold, but they had no time to stop. Ethan's legs burned as he pushed forward, his wife's weight still heavy in his arms. They couldn't afford to slow down. The girl led the way, her movements swift and sure, and Ethan kept close behind, his eyes darting around the narrow passage. "Keep moving," the girl urged, her voice tense. "We're almost there." Ethan's heart was pounding, his breath coming in shallow gasps. He could hear the footsteps getting louder, but he refused to stop. They had to make it. They had to get out. The sound of the pursuit grew closer and closer until it felt like they were being surrounded. Just as the tunnel seemed to close in on them, the girl stopped suddenly, pointing toward the end of the passage. "There," she said, her voice filled with urgency. "The exit is just ahead." "We're almost out." Ethan's breath caught in his throat. They were so close. He pushed forward, the last ounce of his strength carrying them toward the end of the tunnel, toward the freedom that felt so elusive but so desperately needed. As they emerged into the alley, the cool night air hit Ethan's face, and for the first time in what felt like forever, he allowed himself a moment of hope. They were free for now, but he knew they had to keep moving. They couldn't stop until they were safe, and they would do whatever it took to make sure they stayed one step ahead of whoever was hunting them. The night felt endless as Ethan, his wife still limp in his arms, and the girl moved through the shadows, their every step calculated, every sound amplified by the fear that hung in the air. They had barely escaped the clutches of those who hunted them, but the danger was far from over. With each step, Ethan's mind raced, replaying the events that had led them here. He could still hear the screams, the sounds of pursuit. But now, they were in the clear, for the moment. The girl moved with purpose, her eyes scanning the alley, every corner, every shadow. Ethan didn't question her movements. He had no choice but to trust her. She was their only guide through this dark maze. The alley led to a dead end, a wall rising high in front of them, but the girl didn't hesitate. She reached into her jacket and pulled out a small device, pressing a button on it. A hidden panel slid open in the wall, revealing a narrow door. She gestured for Ethan to follow. "This way," she whispered. They moved through the door and into a small room beyond. It was stark and empty, save for a few crates stacked against the walls. Ethan could barely process what was happening. His mind was overwhelmed by the chaos, the danger, but he knew one thing for sure: he had to keep his wife safe. "Where are we now?" Ethan asked, his voice strained. "Just a safe place," the girl replied, her voice low but firm. "They won't find us here. Not yet." Ethan nodded, his heart still pounding in his chest. He looked down at his wife. The bruises on her face, the marks on her arms, they all reminded him of the fragility of the situation. He couldn't afford to lose her. He had to protect her, no matter what. The girl went over to a table in the corner, pulling out another set of papers and a small laptop. She began typing rapidly, her fingers moving with practiced ease. "We need to figure out what they want," she said without looking up. "We need to find their weak point. Ethan walked over to her, glancing at the screen. "What's that?" he asked, trying to make sense of the data in front of him. The girl glanced up at him, her eyes tired but determined. "Information. Their operations. I've been tracking them for months, but they've been careful. They want something. Something big, and it's tied to you." Ethan's head spun. "What do they want from me?" he asked, his voice thick with confusion and fear. The girl paused, her expression serious. "It's not just about your company or your wealth. It's something more. They want to use you, Ethan. They think you're the key to unlocking something that will give them control." Ethan's stomach twisted. The pieces were slowly starting to come together, but the answers still felt out of reach. "How do we stop them?" he asked, his voice low but filled with resolve. The girl's fingers paused on the keyboard as she looked at him. "We don't stop them by fighting head-on. We need to go deeper. We need to take them by surprise. The more they think they control you, the more they'll make mistakes." Ethan nodded, understanding the plan. He had never been one to back down from a challenge, and this was no different. His wife needed him. They both needed him. "What's the first step?" he asked. His voice steadied despite the fear gnawing at his insides. The girl turned back to the laptop and quickly typed in a few commands. The screen flickered before showing a set of blueprints and maps, highlighting a building in the center of the city. "We get inside their headquarters," she said, her voice calm but intense. "Once we're in, we can find out what they're really after, and then we destroy their plans." Ethan's gaze locked on the map. The place was well guarded, heavily secured, but he wasn't afraid. "We'll get in," he said, determination surging through him. The girl nodded, her expression hardening with resolve. "We'll need help," she said, glancing at him. "I can get us in, but we need to be careful. They're watching everything." Ethan took a deep breath. He didn't have time to second-guess their plan. He had to act. He couldn't afford to wait any longer. His wife's life, their lives, depended on it. "We move now," he said. "Let's go." The girl stood up, packing away her laptop and papers. "We'll take the back routes. They'll be looking for us, but we'll be one step ahead." They moved quickly, the girl leading the way through the narrow hallways of the building. Ethan kept his focus on her, trusting her every move. The adrenaline coursing through him made him feel invincible, but he knew better than to let his guard down. They reached the exit, a small side door that opened into an alleyway. The girl glanced over her shoulder, making sure no one had followed them. Ethan felt the weight of the night's events, the danger, but now, there was no turning back. They were in this together, and no matter what, they were going to finish it. The city streets stretched out before them, the lights flickering in the distance. Ethan's mind was focused on one thing, protecting his wife, and finding out who was behind all of this. They had a chance to end this nightmare, but they had to keep moving. They couldn't stop, not until it was over. In this gripping tale of suspense and danger, the life of a billionaire is turned upside down as his wife is abducted by a mysterious organization, leaving him and a young girl to piece together the truth. This black story follows the intense journey of survival as they uncover the powerful enemies behind the plot and the hidden motives driving them. The suspense builds as secrets unfold, revealing a dangerous game of cat and mouse with high stakes. As the protagonist races against time to protect his wife and uncover what the organization truly wants, the black stories of betrayal, survival, and resilience are explored. With every twist and turn, the tension heightens, and the true nature of the adversaries begins to emerge. The black stories told in this narrative are filled with emotional moments, powerful revelations, and the unyielding determination to overcome overwhelming odds. Follow this gripping black story as it unveils the lengths to which a man will go to protect the ones he loves and discover the secrets that will change everything. Through fast-paced action, deep emotional stakes, and a relentless pursuit of justice, this black story is a captivating journey into survival and truth.